The room was still when they pried open the piano. No music, no chatter. Only the groan of century-old wood and the soft rasp of hinges, surrendering after decades of silence. The restoration workshop smelled of sawdust and varnish, but beneath it was something else, a faint metallic tang as if the air itself remembered. The instrument was an upright, built in 1923, its once polished walnut casing now scarred with age. The men who had brought it here had joked about finding rat nests or lost coins, the usual prizes hidden in old furniture. But no one laughed when the back panel shifted free. It wasn't what they expected. Two shapes lay pressed within the hollowed cavity beneath the soundboard, skeletal, yet arranged almost with care. The bones had settled into the curve of the wood, as if molded by time, their positions mirroring one another. One skull tilted slightly toward the other, and though their faces were long gone, there was something in the angle, a quiet intimacy that whispered of connection, not accident. Their rib cages were close enough that, in life, they might have heard each other breathe. And then there was the envelope. It rested between them, browned and brittle, the paper's edges frayed into feathery layers. The ink had faded, but the faint emboss of handwriting still clung to its surface like the shadow of a memory refusing to be erased. Inside was a sheet of music, a nocturne handwritten in careful notation, with strange annotations in the margins. Numbers, initials, and a short line in a slanted script that read, "The last song we'll ever play." It was the kind of thing you wanted to believe was just a romantic flourish, an inside joke between lovers, until you looked again at the bones. The workshop fell silent. A young apprentice, no more than 20, whispered that maybe they should call someone. The lead restorer nodded, his eyes fixed on the music sheet as though it had spoken directly to him. They set the envelope aside, gently lifting the remains into clean forensic bags. The police came quickly. Cameras flashed, latex gloves shifted over hands, evidence tags appeared one after another. Yet, despite the official nature of the scene, the air in that room never lost its strange, heavy quiet, as though the piano itself disapproved of the interruption. When the instruments were packed away and the floor swept, the piano remained, its keys still lined up in perfect white and black order. One of the officers, perhaps out of habit, pressed a single note. The sound was flat, muffled, not the clean ring of a tuned string, but something stifled. That was when someone asked the first question aloud, the one no one had wanted to say. How long have they been in there? The answer would not come quickly. The bones were old, older than the piano itself perhaps, but the envelope was dated only with the year 1923. The paper was dry, brittle, and water-stained in places, yet the ink marks still cut sharp into the fibers, like whispers through time. The handwriting was neither rushed nor panicked. Whoever had written it had taken their time, aligning the bars of music neatly, as though knowing it might be their last creation. The restorer, who had spent decades in the trade, confessed later that he had felt something impossible when he first saw the skeletons. Not fear, but sorrow. Not the sharp sting of tragedy, but the slow drowning kind. The grief that comes from knowing a love story ended in silence and secrecy. By the following morning, word had spread beyond the workshop. Headlines called it the Piano Crypt Mystery, and Skeleton Duet Found in Antique Instrument. Photos of the upright, still open like a coffin, circulated through news feeds, each image casting the same spell. That odd combination of romance and horror, the way tragedy sometimes becomes more haunting when framed in beauty. The police began their work, cataloging the find, tracing the piano's serial number, attempting to identify the music sheet's origin. It would take weeks before the first real clue emerged, not from the piano's mechanics, but from the past. Before this discovery, the upright had been just another antique in a dusty collection, waiting to be sold at a small-town auction. Now it had become a sealed doorway into a story over 100 years in the making. And somewhere within that story were two names, buried not only in time but in shame, in fear, in secrets that families carry so long they begin to forget why. In that moment, with the police tape fluttering faintly in the breeze, with the piano standing open like an unspoken confession, no one in the workshop could yet know that the skeletons would not remain strangers for long. Because DNA, like music, has a way of carrying memory. And this song was far from over. The year was 1914, a year poised on the fragile ledge between the quiet world people thought they knew and the storm they could not yet imagine. In the small Midlands town of Harawford, the air still smelled of coal smoke and wet earth after rain. Horse carts clattered over cobblestones, and in the evenings, the glow from oil lamps painted every street corner in amber haze. Life moved at a pace that allowed people to notice things. The new paint on a neighbor's fence, the scent of lilacs by the church, the way certain windows stayed lit later than they should. It was in one such window, the back room of a modest red-brick terrace house, that Margaret Whittaker would sit at her piano. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, shaping notes into something both tender and defiant. Margaret was 22, with eyes that seemed always half lost in thought, as if her mind was busy listening to music the rest of the world couldn't hear. Her family was respectable, proper, and concerned with appearances. Her father owned a small ironworks. Her mother chaired church committees. In their view, music was a fine hobby for a daughter, but not a calling, and certainly not a reason to invite scandal. Scandal, in their minds, had a name: Thomas Bellamy. Thomas was 24, the son of a railway foreman. His life was less comfortable, but he carried himself with an ease that made people notice him. He played violin in a way that made taverns go quiet, though he rarely performed outside small gatherings. He and Margaret had met 2 years earlier at a harvest festival, drawn together not by introductions but by the sight of each other in the crowd as a band played a waltz. By the time the song ended, they were talking about Chopin as if they'd known each other for years. Their romance grew in borrowed hours, walks along the riverbank at dusk, letters exchanged under the cover of books, moments stolen in the echo of the church's practice room. In those letters, they wrote of concerts they dreamed of attending, of a life somewhere far away where music would not be a pastime but a shared language. But Harawford was not kind to such dreams. Margaret's parents saw Thomas as a man with neither wealth nor influence, someone who could only pull their daughter down. Thomas's father, hardened by years on the rail lines, distrusted fancy people and warned his son against chasing after a woman from upstairs society. The disapproval didn't cool their feelings. If anything, it made them burn hotter. In spring of 1914, they spoke openly, if only to each other, of eloping. Paris, perhaps, or a small village in Scotland where no one knew their names. Margaret began saving money in secret, slipping coins from her allowance into a tin hidden inside the piano bench. But the summer brought a different heat. Tensions in Europe whispered through newspapers and tea shops. Men spoke in low voices about Austria, about Serbia, about alliances like Tinder waiting for a match. Harawford still felt untouched, but the world was shifting under its feet. In August, a letter came to Thomas, a summons. Britain was entering the war. Margaret told him she would go with him, even if it meant following him to the continent as a nurse or aid worker. He told her no, not because he didn't want her there, but because he feared what the war might take from them both. They argued, then fell silent, then played music together late into the night, as if trying to write their love into the air before the world could change it. On the evening of September 2nd, they were seen leaving Harawford Hall, where Margaret had been hired to play at a small gathering. A maid recalled that they were walking quickly, their heads close together, a single suitcase between them. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The next morning, Margaret's bed was unslept. Thomas's small rented room was empty, the few possessions he owned neatly stacked, as if awaiting his return. The suitcase was gone. Rumors began within hours. Some said they'd run away to be married before Thomas shipped out. Others whispered about an accident, a fall into the river after dark. And there were those who spoke of more sinister possibilities. A jealous rival, a political grudge, debts unpaid. Their families filed missing persons reports, but even in those first days, there was an undercurrent of resignation. The Whittakers maintained a tight-lipped dignity, insisting that Margaret must have left of her own accord. The Bellamys grew defensive, accusing the rich of hiding the truth. The war began in earnest weeks later. Young men vanished into uniforms, women into factories and hospitals. The missing lovers became just two names among many unspoken losses. But for a handful of people, a maid who had seen the suitcase, a friend who had heard Margaret's plans, a piano tuner who had noticed something strange at Harawford Hall that very week, the memory of that night never faded. It would take over a century and the opening of an old piano before anyone would hear their names again. The police file, now brittle with age, was once a flurry of fresh ink and official stamps. Back in September 1914, the disappearance of Margaret Whittaker and Thomas Bellamy was treated with a seriousness that lasted exactly as long as the town's attention span allowed. It began in the Whittakers' parlor, where Inspector Harold Greaves stood stiffly before Margaret's parents. The Whittakers insisted their daughter had been misled. Their voices clipped, as though grief were a weakness they refused to wear openly. They provided no letters, no details about Thomas, and certainly no speculation about where Margaret might have gone. When pressed, her father muttered only, "She has made her choice. We will not indulge it further." At the Bellamy home, the atmosphere was entirely different. Thomas's mother wept openly at the kitchen table, a tea towel clenched in her hands. His father, though hardened and curt, admitted he'd feared this would happen the moment his son started mixing with people above his station. But even he seemed convinced. Thomas will write soon. He's not the sort to vanish. Not unless something's kept him. The search for the first 2 weeks, Harauford's police scoured every likely route. The footpaths by the riverbanks, slick with autumn moss, the small rail station on the edge of town, where porters swore they'd seen no young couple matching the description. The surrounding woods, where gamekeepers reported nothing but deer tracks and the occasional fox den. Witness statements trickled in, unreliable, fragmented. An old man at the post office claimed to have seen them boarding a train to Birmingham. A barmaid insisted they'd come into her tavern, asking for directions to the canal road. A milkman swore he'd heard a woman scream near Harauford Hall the night they disappeared, but when police questioned him further, he admitted it could have been a fox. A lead that went nowhere. One clue briefly stirred hope. A railway porter in Coventry reported finding a suitcase abandoned on a bench in the waiting room. It matched the description of the one the couple had been carrying. But when Greaves examined it, the contents were ordinary. A change of clothes, a violin bow, and a folded page of sheet music. The station clerk couldn't say who left it, only that it had been there since before dawn. Without witnesses placing Margaret and Thomas there, the lead dissolved into nothing more than another whisper in a growing fog of uncertainty. The vanishing point by October, the investigation began to stall. Greaves submitted requests to extend the search radius, but the timing was against him. War had shifted priorities, draining manpower from the constabulary. Posters of missing soldiers began to replace the notices for missing civilians. Margaret and Thomas became ghosts in their own town, spoken of in passing, their absence noted in quiet ways. An empty piano bench at church, a missing violinist from the harvest dance. The piano tuner's story, it might have ended there, filed away as another unsolved mystery, if not for a peculiar recollection from Alfred Raines, the local piano tuner. Raines had been called to Harauford Hall, the grand estate where Margaret had played on the night she vanished, just days before the disappearance. He claimed the instrument in the music room was an odd piece, not the hall's usual grand, but a newly delivered upright. What struck him wasn't the look of it, but the sound. Certain keys were muted, the tone swallowed, as though something inside the body was absorbing the vibration. He mentioned it to the house steward, who brushed it off as a settling of the wood. When Greaves pressed for more details, Raines admitted he'd felt uneasy, enough that he shortened the tuning session and left earlier than planned. But in a time when every second house had its quirks and oddities, his remark was filed as irrelevant. A war's convenient curtain by November. Reports from the Western Front dominated every newspaper column. Harauford's young men were enlisting. Those left behind were rationing coal and tallow. A missing couple was no longer a scandal. It was a distraction. The official report closed with a line that felt less like a conclusion and more like surrender. The whereabouts of Miss Margaret Whittaker and Mr. Thomas Bellamy remain unknown. No further inquiries to be made at present. Their families carried on in ways that only deepened the silence. The Whittakers refused to hang Margaret's photograph in the house. The Bellamys kept Thomas's violin in its case on the mantel. Dust gathering on the clasp. Neighbors stopped asking questions. The war made it easy to let the mystery fade. The quiet legacy of an unsolved case, and so the story remained, a footnote in old ledgers, a murmur between those old enough to remember. Young couples walking home at night sometimes spoke of the lovers of Harauford, as if the name alone were enough to keep their memory alive. But there was no grave, no funeral, no closure. Only absence. Absence that, decades later, would be filled, quite literally, by the opening of a piano no one thought to suspect. By the time the forensics team cleared the workshop, the piano no longer looked like an instrument. With its back panel removed and inner bracing exposed, it seemed almost skeletal itself, an empty ribcage of wood and wire. Detective Inspector Elaine Rowcroft stood over it with a small clipboard, listening as the lead restorer recited the serial number. Davenport & Sons, London, Model 12 upright, built 1923. A simple line of text, and yet it opened the first real door in the investigation. First records. London, 1923. The Davenport Archives, housed in a dusty records office in Camden, revealed the piano had been completed in early spring of 1923 and sold just weeks later to an address in Birmingham. The sale ledger included a curious note: special modification, internal bracing adjusted as per client request. The modification wasn't detailed, but the restorer had already confirmed what that meant. The piano's inner cavity was unusually deep for its model, the soundboard raised slightly higher than standard. A quirk of craftsmanship, perhaps, or a deliberate alteration. Owner 1. The Browning Estate from Birmingham. The trail led to the Browning Estate, a sprawling Victorian home that by the late 1920s had already begun its slow decline. The estate's ledgers showed the piano was kept in the east drawing room until 1931, when it was sold at a significant loss. No records explained why, but a surviving Browning relative recalled the unlucky instrument. Her mother refused to keep it in the house after a maid claimed to hear breathing inside it at night. Dismissed at the time as superstition, it was a detail Rowcroft noted carefully. Owner 2, St. Mary's Boarding School for Girls in 1931. The piano was purchased by St. Mary's, a small boarding school in Worcestershire. It was installed in the Assembly Hall, where it stayed for nearly 2 decades. Several former students, now in their 80s, told investigators they remembered it well. One described it as a moody piano, producing rich tones one day and dull, lifeless notes the next. Another recalled a teacher insisting that certain keys not be pressed because they didn't like to be woken. A strange choice of words, but repeated often enough to stick in memory. When the school was forced to close during the Second World War, the piano was sold at auction in 1949. No one paid much attention to it, leaving Owner 3. The parish hall for the next 30 years, the upright sat in a parish hall in Herefordshire, rolled out only for seasonal plays and charity dances. It was painted over at least once, turning its once polished walnut surface a dull uniform brown. By then, whatever history it carried had been dulled too, its past owners forgotten. Still, the parish caretaker remembered something. During a 1962 Christmas rehearsal, a volunteer tried to move the piano and found it far heavier than expected, like it was carrying a passenger. The remark was made in jest, and the rehearsal went on. But decades later, when Rowcroft heard the recording of his statement, it sat differently. Owner 4, a private collector in 1981, the parish sold the piano to a private collector who specialized in antique instruments. His records showed only that he bought it as seen and stored it in a converted barn for almost 20 years. No mention of tuning, no performances, no use. The collector died in 1999, and the piano was sold again, this time to a small-town antiques dealer who kept it in the back of his shop. There it sat, gathering dust, its keys yellowing, until it was purchased in 2012 by a retired couple who wanted a piece with character for their front room. The final transfer in 2023, when the couple downsized, the piano was consigned to a local auction house. It was in preparation for that auction, during a routine cleaning and inspection, that the panel was removed, and the truth finally spilled out. Patterns and ownership. Rowcroft's team noticed something unsettling in the chain of custody. The piano had never stayed in one place for more than 2 decades. In nearly every case, the sale was described in vague terms. Not quite right for the space, too heavy to move, often fallen out of tune. It was as though each owner at some point had felt a quiet nudge to pass it on. The music sheet forensic specialists examined the sheet found with the remains. The paper and ink matched materials used in the early 20th century, consistent with the couple's disappearance in 1914. But the notation style suggested someone deeply familiar with music, possibly even classically trained. In the margins, those strange annotations, numbers and initials, remained a puzzle. One set of initials matched the name of a known piano craftsman active in Birmingham in 1913. It was a faint link, but enough to warrant a deeper look into his work. The provenance report was delivered to Rowcroft in a slim folder. It should have been the kind of dry, logistical document any investigator could skim and file away. But this one read like a whispering ledger, a story of hands passing something they didn't fully understand, a wooden coffin with strings and hammers. If the remains inside were indeed from 1914, it meant they had been moved again and again across towns and counties, carried into rooms full of music, laughter, arguments, and children's lessons. All the while, the truth sat locked behind the keys, untouched except for the occasional note struck in ignorance. And now, finally, the music was beginning to play. The remains were taken to the county forensic lab in sealed evidence containers. 2 long, narrow cases for the skeletons, a smaller one for the envelope and its fragile contents. Even in their sterile new surroundings, the bones carried a strange, quiet gravity, as though they had not yet decided whether to surrender their story. The first look Dr. Lillian Havers, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, began with what the bones could tell without a single test. Both were young adults, late teens to mid-20s. One male, one female, based on pelvic structure and skull morphology. The bones were remarkably well preserved, shielded for decades from sunlight, moisture, and scavenging animals. But one detail was stranger still. Faint scraping along certain rib bones, not like animal gnaw marks, but something deliberate, almost controlled. Havers made a note and set it aside for later review. Carbon dating carbon-14 analysis was the first scientific attempt to place the couple in time. The results came back within days. The date of death fell between 1910 and 1925, a window that overlapped almost exactly with the last confirmed sighting of Margaret and Thomas in September 1914. It was not proof, but it was the first deep tremor beneath the surface of the case. The DNA gamble from there, Havers moved to the most delicate task, extracting viable DNA from the remains. Enclosed for so long, the bones had been protected from most environmental decay, but time still degrades life's code. Tiny samples were taken from femur shafts, the densest bone, best for preserving genetic material, and placed into a clean room for processing. Forensic DNA analysis has a strange poetry to it. Microscopic strands unwound, read like a library written in 4 letters, compared against millions of others. It is science at its most intimate, reaching back through generations to say, I know who you are. The match it took weeks. Weeks in which the piano sat in storage, guarded, catalogued, photographed from every angle. Weeks in which old newspapers were combed, marriage records checked, obituaries reread. Weeks in which descendants on both sides of the Whittaker and Bellamy families received quiet phone calls they could not yet understand. And then the email came. Female remains. Probable match. Margaret Whittaker. Male remains. Probable match. Thomas Bellamy. The match was made through genealogical triangulation. Surviving descendants of Margaret's elder sister and Thomas's younger brother had agreed to submit DNA samples. The genetic overlap was undeniable. The press conference Detective Rowcroft stood before a crowded room the following morning. The headline was already written in every journalist's mind before she spoke. Skeletons in piano linked to lovers missing since 1914. But Rowcroft's words were measured, careful. Part fact, part restraint. She confirmed the match, the estimated time of death, the connection to the long unsolved disappearance. She did not speculate on cause of death, nor on who might have placed them in the piano. The investigation, she said, was ongoing. And then, without naming them directly, she acknowledged something that made the room shift. They appear to have died together, side by side. Whatever happened, they did not face it alone. The emotional fallout for the Whittaker family, what remained of it, the news was met with silence. An elderly great-nephew contacted by the press offered only that he was glad to have the record set straight. No memorial was planned. The Bellamy descendants reacted differently. Thomas's great-niece, a retired schoolteacher, spoke through tears in a local radio interview. We grew up with a shadow in the family. A story nobody wanted to finish telling. Now we know the ending and it's worse than we imagined, but at least it's an ending. The music sheet revisited with the identities confirmed. The sheet of music took on a new weight. It was not just an artifact, It was the last written trace of Margaret and Thomas's shared life. A music historian brought in to examine it noted that the nocturne itself was based on a popular composition of the late 19th century, but the marginal notes, the numbers and initials, appeared to be some kind of code. One theory was that they marked meeting points or times, perhaps tied to an attempted escape. Another suggested they were coordinates, though none matched any known maps of the era. In the bottom right corner, the handwriting slanted slightly, as though the pen had been lifted and replaced mid-word, the kind of subtle interruption you only notice if you're looking for it. The unavoidable question with the science settled, the question became inescapable. How did they get there? The theory of an accident collapsed immediately. The bodies had not been crammed into the piano after death in a panicked rush. They had been arranged. Carefully. Almost tenderly. Whoever placed them there had done so with an attention that was chilling in its intimacy. The more Rowcroft studied the provenance of the piano, the more it felt as if the instrument itself had been built for concealment. Not as a spur-of-the-moment decision, but as part of a plan. The confirmation of their names changed the tone of the entire case. It was no longer about two anonymous figures in an antique. It was about Margaret and Thomas, people who had walked the streets of Haraufid, who had dreamed of Paris, who had written to each other in the language of music. For over 100 years, every note played on that piano had been underlined by the silent duet inside. And now the silence was over. War has a way of erasing questions. In the autumn of 1914, as British troops sailed for the Western Front, the disappearance of a young couple in Haraufid was not just a small-town tragedy. It was a story the world no longer had the time to tell. The first silences when Margaret and Thomas vanished, their absence was a sharp wound in a small community. But within weeks, the lists of the missing were no longer about lovers, runaways, or petty crimes. They were about soldiers, boys barely out of school, whose names appeared in the paper alongside words like presumed dead and no further information. Every household was touched. Every conversation bent toward the war. The search for two young lovers simply could not compete with the headlines from Ypres and Mons. The disappearing evidence in those early months. Haraufid's police force was already losing officers to the draft. Records show that Inspector Harold Greaves, who'd led the initial inquiry, was reassigned to oversee wartime security at a munitions depot before the year was out. His unfinished files, including the Whittaker-Bellamy disappearance, were left behind in the hands of a clerk with no authority to pursue them. Paper itself became scarce. Many smaller police stations reused forms, burned outdated files for heating, or stored non-essential cases in damp cellars where ink faded and pages stuck together. In that chaos, whatever leads existed, names of witnesses, times, receipts, could vanish in weeks. The families divide the war also deepened the rift between the Whittaker and Bellamy families. The Whittakers, well-connected and socially cautious, began framing Margaret's disappearance as a choice, a private shame not to be discussed in polite company. They never publicly accused the Bellamys, but the implication was there. Thomas had lured her away, and she had gone willingly. The Bellamys, meanwhile, clung to the belief that something had been done to the couple, that someone had ensured they would never return. But with Thomas's younger brother drafted and his father working double shifts on the rail lines, they had no means to push for answers. Both sides found it easier to bury the story beneath the larger grief of the war. And in that mutual retreat, the truth found cover. Haraufid Hall and the quiet transaction. One of the most tantalizing absences in the record concerns Haraufid Hall, where Margaret played the night she disappeared. The estate's ledgers for late 1914 are missing, torn from the bound books according to archivists. The few remaining entries around that period make no mention of the upright piano that would later appear in the hall's music room. What we do know is that the owner of the hall, Lord Edward Haraufid, left for the continent in October 1914, serving as a liaison officer in France. His household staff was reduced to a skeleton crew, and the hall was later used for convalescing officers. That shuffle of servants, soldiers, and estate managers created a perfect blur in which furniture could be moved, sold, or replaced without note. It was in that blur historians believe that the piano, with its hidden contents, could have been quietly relocated, perhaps even purposefully passed to another owner who would not think to question its weight. The advantage of chaos for someone seeking to hide a crime. There could have been no better moment. Rail schedules were disrupted. Postal routes were rerouted. Trains moved day and night, carrying troops, weapons, and supplies. A piano, heavy, awkward, easily written off as estate furniture, could be shipped by rail without attracting attention, especially if labeled for donation to a school or parish. The war became not just a background to the crime, but its cloak. Whispers that never reached paper oral history from Haraufid hints at something darker. In the 1970s, a local historian named Jeanette Wilkes interviewed surviving townsfolk about life during the war. In one taped conversation, an elderly woman recalled hearing her mother speak of the girl from the Whitaker family who never came back, and the fine young man she was with. When Wilkes asked what had happened, the woman answered quietly, "They put her in the piano, love. That's what my mother always said. They put them both in and closed the lid. And the war kept it quiet." Wilkes dismissed it at the time as a macabre folktale. But after the discovery in 2023, her notes, kept in a private archive, suddenly seemed less like gossip and more like the unrecorded truth. Why no one spoke in small towns? Silence can be as strong a tradition as Sunday service. To speak of certain things is to invite trouble. Legal trouble, social trouble, family trouble. If even a handful of people knew or suspected what had happened to Margaret and Thomas, the war offered them both a reason and an excuse to stay quiet. Every year that passed after the armistice made the silence easier. Those who might have been implicated grew older. Those who might have testified died. And the piano became just another piece of furniture, traded, stored, and forgotten. The unwritten chapter by the timepiece returned in 1918. The case was no longer a case. It was a family shame, a fading rumor, a "do you remember?" in the back corners of pub conversations. Somewhere in those missing records and half-buried accounts lies the decision that sealed their fate. Not just their deaths, but the century of quiet that followed. Whether it was made in anger, in panic, or in cold calculation, the war ensured that decision would never be challenged. The piano was nearly ready to be sealed again for transport to the forensic storage facility when one of the restorers noticed something odd wedged inside the lower frame. A slim, rust-darkened tool no longer than a forearm. It was a tuning key, the kind piano tuners used to adjust the tension of strings. Most were plain, functional pieces of steel or brass. This one was different. An engraving in the metal beneath the corrosion, the tool bore an engraving. 2 letters intertwined in a decorative flourish, HM. The font was old-fashioned, not unlike the ornamental monograms found on early 20th century business signage. The restorer slipped it into an evidence bag and handed it to Detective Rowcroft, who immediately sent it for examination. Within days, the lab confirmed the metal matched the composition used by several Birmingham-based instrument makers before 1920. One name stood out: Henry Moore & Sons, a small but respected piano workshop active between 1905 and 1918. The Moore Connection archival digging revealed that Henry Moore & Sons was known for special commissions: pianos with hidden compartments for sheet music storage, custom soundboard shapes, even concealed safes for valuables. Their work was expensive, bespoke, and almost always done for wealthy private clients. Among their recorded commissions was a 1913 order for structural modification to accommodate atypical internal specifications, the exact phrasing seen in the Davenport ledger for the 1923 piano. The name of the commissioning party for the 1913 order was conspicuously absent. The page was intact, but the line where a name should have been was left blank, as if deliberately omitted. The 2-year gap the date gnawed at Rowcroft. Why would a custom modification be ordered in 1913 for an upright piano, yet the instrument in question wasn't built until 1923? One possibility: the modification plans were prepared in 1913, but the order itself, for reasons unknown, was not completed until after the war. Perhaps the original piano was damaged, or perhaps the plans were simply reused by Davenport and Sons a decade later. But that left another question, darker and harder to shake. Had the atypical internal specifications been intended all along to hold more than just music? The surviving apprentice through the thinnest thread of luck, investigators tracked down a surviving relative of one of Moore's apprentices. Among his belongings was a small notebook, a log of workshop tasks and sketches. One sketch showed the outline of a piano's internal frame, with measurements for a widened cavity and reinforced bracing. In the margin, scrawled in pencil, were 3 words: client insists secrecy. The sketch bore the same HM monogram as the tuning key. A list of clients' more surviving business correspondence listed several clients in the Birmingham area, including members of the aristocracy, industrial magnates, and one very familiar name: Lord Edward Haraufid, owner of the estate where Margaret had last been seen playing in 1914. No direct record linked Haraufid to the specific modified piano, but the overlap was enough to tilt the investigation in a new direction. A tool left behind, why would a tuning key, engraved no less, be left inside the piano for a century? Rowcroft's theory was unsettling. Perhaps whoever sealed the couple inside had intended to return to make some adjustment, or even to open the piano again. But the war intervened, lives changed, and the instrument passed into other hands. In that scenario, the tuning key wasn't just a forgotten tool, it was a ghost of intent, trapped with the bodies it had helped to conceal. The music box hypothesis, one of the forensic engineers studying the piano's frame, proposed something chilling. The modified cavity, with its raised soundboard, might have created an acoustic effect that subtly muted certain frequencies, enough to mask the presence of objects inside while still allowing the piano to play convincingly. In other words, the piano had been engineered not just to hide the couple physically, but to hide them sonically. To anyone listening, the sound would be slightly unusual but not obviously wrong. Like a singer with a cold, not a body in a coffin. What this meant for the case, the tuning key transformed the investigation. Until now, the story could still have been framed as a crime of opportunity. Two lovers killed, hidden in the nearest convenient space. But with this evidence, the tone shifted. This was not convenience. This was design. Someone had ordered a piano to be altered in a way that made it an ideal long-term hiding place. The fact that it connected, however indirectly, to Lord Haraufid's name brought the case back to its most dangerous ground: the place and people who might have had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to make Margaret and Thomas disappear. The key, still in its evidence bag, sat on Rowcroft's desk for weeks. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, but heavy in a way that had nothing to do with metal. In its tarnished surface, she saw the turning point of the investigation. The moment the piano stopped being an accident of fate and became a machine of intent. By 1931, the piano had already passed quietly from the Browning estate into the hands of St. Mary's boarding school for girls in Worcestershire. On paper, it was a practical donation. The school's old assembly hall piano was beyond repair, and a local benefactor arranged for a fine second-hand upright to be delivered. But the girls of St. Mary's remembered it for other reasons. First impressions: the piano arrived in late autumn, shrouded in a heavy canvas cover that smelled faintly of damp. The delivery men wheeled it into the hall, unwrapped it, and left without ceremony. Its varnish was a rich brown, though dulled, and the keys were yellowed at the edges. The headmistress commented that it had character, the polite term for something old enough to be considered either charming or flawed. When the music teacher, Miss Abernathy, first played it, she frowned. Certain notes, low in the bass register, rang softer, almost swallowed. She blamed the drafty room, the wood still adjusting to its new environment. The nocturne rule within weeks, an unspoken rule emerged among the girls. Do not play after dark. The origin of the rule was murky. Some said it came from Miss Abernathy herself, others that it was passed quietly from older students to younger ones. The story went that if you played a specific nocturne, Margaret's nocturne, though the girls didn't know her name, the piano would answer. Not in words, but in the way certain notes would sound slightly wrong. The final chord, in particular, seemed to carry a faint, muffled echo, like a voice trapped under the music. The first dream, one of the earliest accounts, came from a girl named Elsie, who in 1933 dared to play the nocturne during a winter evening rehearsal. That night, she dreamed she was standing on a riverbank, holding a violin she didn't know how to play. A woman in a pale dress stood beside her, saying nothing, just looking toward the water. When Elsie woke, the tune from the nocturne was still running through her head. She told no one at first. But months later, when another girl confessed to dreaming of a woman by the river after playing the same piece, the story began to spread. A history of small incidents over the years. Small, unnerving incidents accumulated. Keys pressed themselves down when no one was near the piano. Pages of sheet music on the stand would sometimes turn without help. A faint smell of varnish and something metallic would linger after certain songs. Some staff dismissed it as girlish imagination. Others quietly encouraged the superstition. If it kept the girls from lingering in the hall after lights out, all the better. The tuning visit in 1941, during the war years, the school brought in a local tuner named Frederick Dean. His logbook, discovered decades later, contained a single cryptic line beside the St. Mary's entry. Unusual damping in frame, not due to felts. Advised no alteration. Dean's grandson would later tell reporters that his grandfather had been spooked by the piano, claiming it had a resonance that didn't belong to the strings. The Dream Archive in the 1970s, a former pupil named Caroline Ingram began collecting stories from her classmates about their time at St. Mary's. Many were light-hearted, pranks, crushes, exam day panic, but a handful mentioned the piano dreams. The descriptions varied in detail but shared certain motifs: a woman in early 20th century clothing, the sound of a violin, sometimes faint, sometimes clear, the sense of waiting for something or someone who never arrived. One account described the woman holding sheet music with numbers scribbled in the margins, though the dreamer couldn't remember what they were upon waking. The last year, by the late 1940s, the piano was already showing signs of age. Some keys stuck, the tone had grown uneven, and funds for proper restoration were scarce in the post-war years. When the school closed temporarily in 1949 due to structural damage from bomb blasts, much of its furniture was sold off. The upright was purchased at a modest price by a parish hall in Herefordshire, the next step in its long journey. For most, its departure was unremarkable. But one teacher, interviewed decades later, admitted she was quietly relieved to see it go. Not because she believed the stories, she said, but because some objects carry a weight that doesn't belong in a place meant for children. Why this mattered to the case for Detective Rowcroft, the St. Mary's chapter was important not because it proved anything supernatural, but because it demonstrated consistency. Multiple witnesses across decades described the same muted notes. Several independently referenced a specific piece of music, the same nocturne found with the bodies. The school's own maintenance records showed no structural changes that could explain the anomaly. It suggested that even without knowing the truth, people could sense that something was inside the piano, something that didn't belong. By the time the piano left St. Mary's, it had been part of hundreds of assemblies, holiday performances, and music lessons. Yet all along its true duet, the one between two silent skeletons, remained unheard except in the faintest, most unsettling ways. And now, with the investigation retracing its steps, the piano was ready to give up its next secret. Detective Rowcroft had handled difficult interviews before. Grieving parents, evasive suspects, witnesses who lied with a smile. But nothing prepared her for the conversations she would have with the living relatives of Margaret Whittaker and Thomas Bellamy. These weren't people who had lost someone recently. They had inherited an absence, a gap in the family tree so old that it had become a fixture, like a locked room no one dared open. The Whittaker side, the Whittaker line had dwindled over the years, scattering into smaller branches across the UK. When Rowcroft first contacted Eleanor Whittaker, an 82-year-old great-niece of Margaret, the woman's voice was polite but distant. "I don't know what you expect me to say," Eleanor began. Margaret ran off. "That's the family story. My father said she was headstrong and, well, it was another time." When Rowcroft explained the discovery, the piano, the remains, the DNA match, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then a sigh, dry and brittle. "If it's her, then at least that's the end of it. But you won't find my lot putting flowers anywhere. She embarrassed the family. She left the family. That's all." There was no anger in her voice, only the cold efficiency of someone repeating a script learned long ago. To the Whittakers, Margaret's disappearance had been rewritten as a voluntary exile, an act that justified forgetting her. The Bellamy side, the Bellamys were different. Thomas's family had stayed largely in the Midlands, carrying his name like a small, stubborn torch. When Rowcroft visited Marion Bellamy, a retired schoolteacher and Thomas's great-niece, the welcome was cautious but warm. The moment she heard the names Margaret and piano, Marion's hands went to her mouth. She sank into a chair, her eyes wet, before Rowcroft had finished. "My grandfather, Thomas's brother," he used to say, "they took him from us. But he never told us who they were. We thought it was war. Or a robbery. Or I don't know. But we never stopped wondering. Marian led Rowcroft to a small wooden box on her mantel. Inside were two objects: a photograph of Thomas, young and unsmiling in his work clothes, and a folded letter written in a flowing hand. The letter was from Margaret. It spoke of plans, just a few more days, and mentioned playing our song one last time before we go. The date was a week before they vanished. Two different inheritances for the Whitakers. Margaret was a cautionary tale. For the Bellamys, Thomas was an open wound. This difference in emotional inheritance was striking to Rowcroft. The Whitakers had incentive to bury the scandal and maintain a narrative of voluntary departure. The Bellamys had incentive to seek, but no resources, no influence, and no answers. This divide also hinted at something darker. If anyone in the Whitaker family had known the truth, they had chosen not to share it. Not even with the family of the man who died alongside her. The interview that shifted everything among the Bellamy relatives was one man, Alan Bellamy, in his 50s, who had pursued amateur genealogy for years. He had traced both the Bellamy and Whitaker lines, collecting baptismal records, census entries, and, most intriguingly, a diary belonging to a Whitaker cousin named Frederick. Frederick's diary entry for September 3, 1914, read, "Margaret did not return last night. Father says she will not be mentioned again in this house. Mother wept in the morning room. I overheard something about the hall. They say there will be no inquiry." The phrasing, "there will be no inquiry," suggested influence, a decision made above the police level. Old bitterness, new clues. When Rowcroft shared this entry with Eleanor Whitaker, she bristled. "You can't put weight on gossip written in a boy's diary," she said. But her defensiveness was telling. With Marian Bellamy, the same entry was met with grim acceptance. "If it was the hall, that makes sense," she murmured. "People like that could make anything disappear." The reluctant acknowledgement eventually, Eleanor did share one thing: a faded family photograph from 1913 showing Margaret at the Whitaker estate garden party. In the background, barely in focus, was a tall man in a dark suit speaking to Lord Edward Haraufid. "That's the only time I ever heard her name mentioned with the hall," Eleanor admitted. "After that, the connection was erased, I suppose. We didn't keep her things. Didn't want to." The emotional undercurrent as the interviews unfolded, Rowcroft felt the tone of the investigation shift. It was no longer just about physical evidence or provenance. It was about memory. How families curate it, how they alter it, how they weaponize it. The Whitakers had amputated Margaret from their story to preserve their own standing. The Bellamys had kept Thomas alive in theirs, to keep the loss from consuming them. And somewhere in the middle, between erasure and remembrance, lay the truth of what had happened in 1914. A lead into the final night from Marian's box of family papers came one more fragment, a tiny torn page of sheet music in Thomas's handwriting. It matched the nocturne found in the piano almost exactly, down to the key changes, except for one missing bar. When the two were placed side by side, the missing bar from Thomas's copy corresponded exactly to the section in Margaret's sheet where the mysterious numbers and initials were written. It was the first physical link tying both lovers directly to that coded margin, and perhaps to the plan they never lived to see through. The descendants had given Rowcroft more than she'd hoped for: a confirmation of the emotional stakes, a diary hinting at interference from Haraufid Hall, and a direct link between the coded music and both victims. The next step was to take all of that and reconstruct the last hours of their lives, to step as closely as possible into the night they disappeared. The night of September 2, 1914, began like many others for Margaret Whitaker, with music. Haraufid Hall, an imposing estate framed by manicured lawns and flickering gas lamps, was hosting a modest gathering. No grand ball, the war had tempered excess, but a polite evening for select guests. Margaret had been hired to play during the post-dinner hours, her piano placed in the music room where polished wood reflected the amber glow of candelabras. Her fingers moved over the keys with precision, but her mind was elsewhere. She was watching the door, waiting for the man who had promised to meet her before the night was out. Thomas Bellamy entered the hall by the service corridor, avoiding the main reception. His violin case was slung over his shoulder, though inside was not just his instrument but a small leather satchel containing their packed belongings, a change of clothes, travel papers, and the money Margaret had been saving for months. They had agreed tonight would be their last performance in Hereford. Afterward, they would slip away to the station, take the late train south, and from there, freedom. The last song Margaret began playing the nocturne, their song. She had altered the sheet slightly, incorporating the coded notations they had devised. To any listener, it was simply a romantic piece. To Thomas, standing at the back of the room, each change in key was a signal. I'm ready. The time is now. The interruption, but not everyone was oblivious. As the final chord faded, a man stepped into the doorway. Tall, sharply dressed, with the easy stillness of someone used to control. Witness accounts decades later would suggest this was Lord Edward Hereford himself. He spoke quietly to Margaret, too quietly for others to hear, but those who recalled the moment said her hands froze on the keys. Her face drained of color. She nodded once, rose from the bench, and followed him from the room. Thomas moved instinctively to intercept, but another man, broader, rougher, likely a member of the household staff, blocked his path. Words were exchanged, low and tense. Whatever was said was enough for Thomas to set his jaw and follow. The corridor they were led down, a narrow corridor that connected the music room to a small, seldom-used study. Inside sat an upright piano, not the grand from the main room, but a plainer instrument, dark wood, new enough to smell faintly of fresh varnish. This was no accident. The confrontation Hereford closed the door. Accounts here become speculation, drawn from fragments in diaries, tone in surviving letters, and the arrangement of the remains. But the outline is clear. The couple was confronted about their intention to leave. Margaret was accused of disgracing her family. Thomas was likely threatened, perhaps with prison, perhaps with accusations that could ruin him and those he cared for. The war gave such threats weight. In 1914, being painted as unpatriotic or disloyal could destroy a man overnight. The conversation escalated. Thomas stepped forward. The larger man moved to restrain him. Margaret protested. There was a brief struggle, not wild, but enough to push the confrontation into dangerous territory. The next moments are impossible to prove in sequence, but the outcome is unshakable. They were silenced. Whether by force, by poison, or by some other means, their bodies were rendered lifeless in that study. The piano's true purpose, the upright, had been prepared. The soundboard sat higher than normal, creating a cavity large enough to hold two human bodies if arranged carefully. They were placed inside, side by side, their hands near one another. The coded music sheet, perhaps taken from Margaret's bench in the main room, was folded and set between them, as if to seal them in with the one thing that had always connected them. The panel was fixed into place. From the outside, the piano looked unchanged. The departure that same night, under cover of the hall's deliveries and wartime transport chaos, the piano was moved. It may have been labeled as new furniture, a donation, or simply goods in transit. No one stopped to ask why an instrument was leaving the hall so soon after its arrival. Within days, it was in Birmingham under the name of a buyer who exists nowhere in the records, a gap in the provenance that has never been bridged. The world moves on. By the time the Whittaker and Bellamy families realized the couple was missing, the piano was already out of sight. By the time the police began asking questions, it was likely in a different town altogether. War swallowed the rest. Why they were left together, one detail from the skeletal arrangement has haunted every investigator. They were not crammed in haphazardly. They were placed. Whether this was an act of twisted sentimentality or simply practicality is unknowable. But it meant that for over a century, their remains stayed in a kind of silent embrace. Two lives interrupted, frozen in proximity. The final glimpse, the last person to see them alive, may well have been Hereford himself, or whoever he entrusted to handle the situation. That person, or persons, made the decision not only to kill but to hide them in plain sight. And in doing so, they created a relic, an instrument that would pass through generations, carrying within it a secret no one could hear unless they knew the song. The reconstruction could never be perfect, but in tracing the couple's movements, the coded sheet music, and the piano's path, Rowcroft had brought the investigation to its emotional peak. The next step would be the return to the present, to the museum, to the restored piano, and the final haunting question of what remains when love is buried in wood and wire for 100 years. The piano stood in the museum gallery, bathed in soft, indirect lighting. Its walnut casing gleamed, polished to a sheen that belied the weight of its history. To the casual visitor, it looked like a beautiful antique, an elegant survivor of a bygone age. Only the small brass plaque at its base hinted at its dark significance. Davenport & Sons upright piano, 1923, contained human remains linked to the 1914 disappearance of Margaret Whittaker and Thomas Bellamy. The first performance on a quiet weekday morning, the museum hosted a private event for those connected to the investigation. Detective Rowcroft was present, along with Dr. Lillian Havers, the forensic team, and a handful of invited guests, including Marion Bellamy. A young pianist from the local conservatory had been asked to play the nocturne found with the bodies. The original sheet was too fragile to use, but a carefully transcribed copy rested on the stand. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, as if seeking silent permission. Then the first notes emerged. Soft, deliberate, almost tentative, as if the instrument were waking from a long sleep. The muffled key, the opening phrases flowed easily, warm and resonant. But in the lower register, one note did not ring true. It wasn't out of tune. It wasn't broken. It was muted. A faint, muffled thud that didn't belong in the clean architecture of the melody. Heads turned subtly toward the sound, drawn without conscious thought. The pianist continued, reaching the closing bars, letting the final chord bloom into silence. But silence was not what followed. Somewhere in the aftertone, an almost imperceptible vibration lingered, as if the piano were still holding onto the note, refusing to let it go. The reaction, Marion Bellamy's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She did not cry, not yet, but her eyes glistened. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the sound my grandfather described. It makes your chest feel heavy, like someone is standing right behind you." Rowcroft said nothing. She simply looked at the instrument. A thing of beauty, yes, but also a coffin, a witness, and, in its own way, a participant. Theories in the room after the performance. Quiet conversations rippled through the gallery. Some speculated that the muffled note was the legacy of the 1913 modifications, the resonance forever altered by the space it had concealed. Others wondered if it was coincidence, a quirk of wood and wire. But for those who knew the story, coincidence felt like too small a word. The pianist's comment as she packed up her music, the young pianist admitted she had felt something unusual while playing. A subtle resistance in the keys, like a faint tension under her fingers. "It's not mechanical," she said softly. "It's like the piano knows when you're playing that song." The room fell silent. No one laughed. No one moved. The curator's choice, the museum's curator, had debated whether to allow the piano to be played at all. Some argued it should remain purely a static exhibit, its history preserved but never reawakened. Others felt that sound was part of the story, that it needed to be heard to be understood. In the end, the curator chose to let it speak, but only rarely, and only for the nocturne. Anything else, he said, would feel like trespass. The last chord, as the gathering dispersed, Rowcroft lingered, her hand resting lightly on the instrument's edge. She pressed one key, not the muffled one, but a bright middle note. It rang cleanly, fading into the high-ceiling gallery. Then she pressed the muted key. The same dull, soft thud filled the air, just as it had during the performance. It didn't last long, but it lasted just long enough to make her wonder if somewhere deep in the layered grain of the wood, something of Margaret and Thomas still waited, not for justice anymore, but simply to be remembered. The museum closed for the night. Lights dimmed. Footsteps faded. The faint echo of doors locking lingered in the quiet halls. In the corner of the gallery, the piano stood alone. Its polished surface reflected the low emergency lights, turning it into a dark silhouette against the walls of history. No hands touched its keys. No music filled the air. And yet, in the stillness, it seemed to hold something. Not a sound exactly, but the suggestion of one. A century of silence for more than 100 years, Margaret Whittaker and Thomas Bellamy had been together in the only way left to them. Enclosed in a narrow cavity of wood and wire, their story muffled by decades of distance. The world outside had changed beyond recognition. Wars had been fought and ended. Families who once argued over their names had grown old and died. Streets had been paved over, towns reshaped, and the hall where they last played together had long since been demolished. But inside the piano, time had moved differently. The question that remains no investigation could answer every question. Who first imagined the piano as their tomb? Who lifted them inside and closed the panel for the last time? Why keep them together, almost tenderly, in death? The evidence was too old. The witnesses long gone. The paper trail lost to fire and war. The truth might always remain behind that same closed panel, not for lack of looking, but because it had been crafted to vanish. The nature of memory in the end, it was not justice that the piano delivered, but remembrance. Their names had returned to the world. Their faces, captured in a few surviving photographs, were now tied to something more than whispers. For the Bellamys, it meant an end to the wondering. For the Whitakers, it meant confronting a chapter they had sealed away. For everyone else, it was a reminder. Love stories do not always end in warmth. Sometimes, the most enduring romances are the ones interrupted. The final image, some visitors who see the piano now walk away unsettled. Others linger, tracing the grain of the wood, imagining the music that once rose from it. But a few, the ones who know the nocturne, will sometimes lean close to the keys and press that muted note. They will hear the dull, soft thud. And in that imperfect sound, they will sense the weight of a century, the closeness of two figures who should have had a life ahead of them, and the quiet truth that not all silences are empty. A love that refused to leave Margaret and Thomas were gone. But the way they were found had made them impossible to forget. The piano was no longer just an object. It was a witness, a vessel, and in its own way, a monument. Long after the museum lights are switched off each night, it remains there. Still dignified. Still holding the kind of silence that hums with memory. And if there is such a thing as a last song, perhaps this was theirs. Not played into the air, but held inside where no one could touch it, for more than 100 years.